Nancy Mahon, SVP Global Corporate Citizenship and Sustainability over at the Estée Lauder companies. So it is wonderful to have all of you here, and I want to help each of you just tell a little bit about the work that you've already done, because we've got a corporate level helping other corporates. We've got, of course, from the grassroots level, helping individual impacts and thinking about a sustainable and fair change there. And also very much from the corporate level already in action. So let's start with the consultancy role to a certain extent, Dickon. And what does a just transition mean for you, and robust? What is it turning into in terms of conversations that you're having on the daily?
Well, thank you, Caroline, for the question. So I think a just transition to us is not only ethically the right thing to do, I think it's a prerequisite to move at the speed and scale that is required. I mean, if we just look at some of the numbers from the transition, we're looking at $4 to $5 trillion or more of annual investment for the next 30 years. That's like half a COVID event or a COVID event every year. And you see how distortionary that is to the economy, what that will do. And our sense is that that number may actually be quite a bit bigger. If you look at the investment required going into the developing world, the investment dollars per GDP are probably twice what they are for the developed world. So, you know, how do you get that level of capital formation? Hundreds of millions of jobs will be both kind of created and dislocated in some form. And not just workers impacted, it's going to impact consumers, energy prices, et cetera. So that's on the transition side. And then when you look on the physical side, the work that we've done before shows that, you know, up to 200 million people in India, for example, could experience a lethal heat wave by 2030. That number could be 1 billion people globally by 2050. So just the numbers are massive. So the idea that you can move, you know, do the biggest reallocation of capital in human history, change the basis of competition of the economy, and not have that be just, is very hard to think. And it gets back a little bit to I think the Franz Timmermans quote from the EU Commissioner. You know, if there is no just transition, there just won't be a transition. So we think about it at McKinsey in terms of sustainable, inclusive growth as the answer. It needs to be sustainable because we hit real planetary boundaries. It needs to be inclusive for all the reasons that we just described. You have to expand energy access to services, and deal with some of the social dislocations. But there needs to be growth. You need to create surplus to fund the transition. You need massive amounts of upfront financing. You need to think through what that does to national debt levels. And you need to lift people out of poverty. So that's how we look at it. And then I just lastly say that, you know, against that, we're doing 3 things. The first is we spend a lot of time and resource on research. So last year we did a big piece on physical risk, but this year now looking at the transition risk and the socioeconomic dislocation, and we find that it's not just the developing countries that are impacted. You know, in the US, you see quite a bit of impact too. The second thing we're doing on the client side is we would like to become, or we aim to become, the largest private sector catalyst for decarbonization. We're trying to measure impact holistically across all our clients and take them on that journey and embed sustainability in everything we do. And then finally, we're trying also to work with NGOs in various forms, and Gloria and I were talking before, through things like McKinsey.org. We have an effort, just one effort by way of example, community-driven. It's called Rethinking Recycling down in Indonesia. So we're trying to give back in that way too. But that's a bit of a frame.
A bit of a perspective there. Gloria, as an award-winning organizer, an award-winning writer, when you're thinking about the just transition, how just is it thus far?
So I'm appreciating this question from a lot of different angles, especially in this moment that we're in, that's really requiring that all of us do more. And communities in particular are calling for us to center racial justice in our climate strategy. And at the Solutions Project, what that means for us is disrupting the status quo. And so we are at the center of kind of the junction between philanthropy and the climate justice movement. And communities are saying we need to be responding to their needs. And we know that historically, it's Black, Indigenous, immigrant, women of color, and other people of color that have been historically underinvested and disinvested in. for decades and generations in some cases. And so doing more for us means we need to invest at least $10 million annually, which we are doing, in Black, Indigenous, immigrant, women, and women of color-led organizations and communities. And the other part of our strategy, in addition to the grant making, is amplifying the solutions that are coming from these communities. And so when I think about a just transition, that means that it's about centering the communities that are on the front lines of environmental degradation. And it's only then that we're actually going to ensure that we have a clean energy economy that benefits all people and communities. A just transition means labor and community alliances. We got to be thinking about jobs and apprenticeship opportunities, good jobs, good paying jobs with benefits, and how to transition workers from dirty industries into cleaner industries, and what's the entree point for new workers to enter into these industries. When I'm thinking about a just transition, it's recognizing that a lot of the values behind how we operate today are rooted in colonialism. It's a colonized mindset where we've literally commodified people and our places and resources and our land. And so what that has generated is mass consumption, mass production, mass waste, profit at any cost, meaning lives are often lost. And when you're looking at who's on the front lines, it's sadly racialized and based on class. And so we really need to shift away from those outdated values and start thinking about what does it mean to be sustainable, to be thinking about today as much as we think about tomorrow? What does it mean to think about a regenerative economy, to have an economy that's rooted in care and not sacrifice? So this is the moment. This is, to me, what the moment is calling for. And when I think about how we're doing okay, but we can be doing better. And the moment is requiring us to do better and to do more.
Well said. And Nancy, how is your organization, of course, the Estee Lauder Company, like very much a family business rooted and still very purposeful with how it's thinking about sustainability? But you yourself, your background is so fascinating because you've worked with administrations. Of course, you worked under President Obama in 2011 to be the chair of the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. You understand how to do grass-level communication as well as within a corporate. What does just transition mean for you personally and for you at your corporate?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I just want to really acknowledge and thank Gloria for her remarks. It's a perfect segue, I think, into really talking about what does just mean. And to Gloria's great remarks, I think we were just at the beginning of defining that together. And at Estee Lauder, we are a family-founded company. I've been lucky in my career to spend time in 3 different sectors. I think what companies bring to the table, particularly family-founded companies, is our consumers. And to Dickon's early remarks, the understanding of markets and growth. And so what we really need to do together is to lean in on how does climate intersect with other issues? For instance, we have a big funding program in girls' education, and we're going to expand that. The bottom line is, if a girl is educated, the likelihood that she'll be the victim of violence or be able, in a positive way, to get a job and move beyond poverty is very high. So we need to take this, what we sort of a fancy word, intersectionality, this 360-degree approach as companies. And not only, our company, like many, we've hit net zero, we've hit RE100, and we're linking our science-based target now to growth. But we really need to double down and think about what is the democratic notion that we bring as sectors. And for companies, I think it's our employees and also our consumers, and get them engaged. We've had campaigns like the Viva Glam Fund, where 100% of the selling price, which I was lucky enough to run, 100% of the selling price goes to HIV/AIDS. We raised over $500 million through lipstick. So there's a lot of power out there, and I completely agree with Gloria that we are just now at the beginning, and we're here to listen and to partner.
I think that's so true. I think the consumer is desperate to make sort of impactful choices right now, but they have to be steered to a large degree. The consumer, the shareholder, there's so many stakeholders, the employee, that companies right now are thinking about, and they want to, live up to that moment. But What's holding companies back that you speak to at the moment, Dickon? Because it feels like we're all with the program. Everyone's made grandiose statements, but now we've got to see whether people are walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And how are you managing to gauge, to measure what companies are actually achieving right now?
Well, to Nancy's comments earlier, I think this is an all-stakeholder game, and as we look at the transition. We think about like a net zero equation of what it takes to get there. And right now, I think there's ambition, but that equation is not solved today. I think, physically, there's a lot of attention on the technologies need to be deployed, the land, the minerals, but I think there's not enough attention on the societal and economic adjustments. I mentioned that number, $5 trillion. How do you form that amount of capital? How do you redirect it to developing countries? How do you deal with the worker dislocation? Our sense is if you have, the gift of foresight, at least to know where those impacts are going to be, you can deal with it. And then you mentioned, the institutions and governance. I think we do need standards to emerge to measure carbon intensity, probably even on a real-time basis. We need mechanisms for companies to be able to share that, to scale new markets like carbon markets, et cetera. So, yeah, our sense is this is a real team sport, and I think companies are probably used to dealing with themselves and maybe a few other companies, but now you need to deal with NGOs, with technology providers, with governments, with communities, with investors. I mean, if you just take one example of like reskilling, right? We talked about the hundreds of millions of jobs that will move. Reskilling, you probably need the private sector to identify the gaps that are needed. You need an educational institution to deliver the training. You probably need an NGO to do the matching of employers and employees. You might need governments to help with employment insurance, with the transition. And that's before you get to the financial mechanisms of, how do I deal with upfront financing of all these new bits of machinery for low-income communities where financing is hard? How do I deal with the fact that unit energy prices are probably going to go up near term? And you've got to heat your house, even if you're sitting in Northern Europe or the Midwest. This is not just a developing country issue. So it's a bit of an all-stakeholder game in our thinking, and that level of collaboration and planning is not quite where it needs to be yet. And we need more sort of wood behind the arrow of ambition to make it a reality.
Wood behind the arrow. I mean, Gloria, lest we forget, we need a transition because right now energy prices are going through the roof, food costs are going through the roof, and who does that affect the most? Those at the lowest income. And how are the people that you're speaking to right here, right now saying, are they saying I want to transition? Are they understanding that they want to be reskilled, or how are you having those conversations? What is it? What purposeful effects do the communities you're speaking to want to see done by these corporates?
Yeah, and I'll speak to kind of what people are saying in communities is that the transition is underway, and it really are grassroots communities that are taking the lead. Before, if government is there or government is not, the communities are really, the social infrastructure is the backbone of our society. That's who's showing up for communities during COVID even.
Yeah.
They've been showing up for our communities for decades when it comes to climate. And personally, I feel that I'm excited about us having this conversation and people now talking about racial justice and equity. And the only reason that's happening is because people have been organizing and building power for decades. And that's why, change happens from the bottom up. And now that conversation made it to the White House. And so now the Biden-Harris administration has also have a commitment to justice and equity. And so communities are saying we're already leading the way.
How are they leading? Like, what are they doing?
That's an excellent question. And so I think about one of our grantee partners, for example, Native Renewables, Navajo Nation in Arizona. There were 15,000 families that didn't have power. And it was Native Renewables that actually created a community-owned energy and solar grid. And they did training programs and employed people and created jobs and put power into 15,000 families. And just recently with Hurricane Ida, we wanted to deploy some solar generators to all the families who are without power. And we didn't know who to call for that. You know, a lot of these families, including the Navajo Nation, they were once dependent on diesel, right? Like the diesel generators, and now they're all solar power generated. So we're like, let's call Native Renewables. And immediately they were like, this is who you call to purchase these types of solar generators. And that's what we did. And we were able to deploy them to families who were without power in Mississippi, in Louisiana, and most recently with this storm in Texas. And then I get excited about, you know, another grantee partner, Reverend Leo Woodbury. The ice storm that happened earlier this year in Texas primarily, but it also hit Mississippi really hard. And these families were without power and water for weeks. And so it was Reverend Leo Woodbury's organization that found a technology that actually knows how to transmute air into clean drinking water. And they were able to supply that for their families. And lastly, I'd be remiss not to mention the leaders and the grassroots organizations that are really leading the country right here in New York. And that's our grantee partners, Uprose, New York Environmental Justice Alliance, New York Renews, and they passed one of the leading climate policies in the country. And that's the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And that is actually what helped to inform the Biden-Harris commitment, this 40% commitment to justice for environmental justice communities. So that's the leadership that's underway, and that's what I'm really here to celebrate. And I really, you know, you talked about all hands on deck, Dickon, and that's absolutely right. You know, we need our industry leaders, we need government, and we can't forget about joining forces with the social infrastructure. Right? That's really the backbone of this country, and that's often where we forget to invest, and that's really where we should be investing first. And that's who should be informing what these solutions need to look like, because that's going to guarantee that we're all benefiting from this climate economy.
I love the celebration. I also love the optimism, the fire that you're bringing, and I think I want to remind our audience that you've been giving your time, your input into a poll to sort of gauge your optimism levels of how hopeful you are for a just transition. And we were going to bring you the answer to that poll in just a moment. Before we get to that, Nancy, your take on the global perspective. We have such a unique vantage point of what's happening here in the United States with Gloria. What do you see as a global company where you're managing to make impact at a grassroots level with something on consumer base, but also just with your corporate leaders?
Well, we are a U.S.-based company, so I would like to agree with Gloria that the U.S.-based initiative around green energy and incentivizing that is critically important. What we've seen is that actually the structure of climate goals is profoundly democratic, because you have to solve for your green energy solution in the market that you're using it. And so that makes me very optimistic. And I'll give you an example. Gloria mentioned Texas. We are part of a virtual power purchase agreement in Oklahoma and invested in some wind turbines. When the Texas electric crisis hit, some of that energy was then redeployed from Oklahoma, from the grid into Texas. And so the scale, again, that companies can bring by solving locally for green solutions, plus obviously creating jobs in Oklahoma. So that makes me very, very optimistic. We have our job cut out for us, as Dickon and Gloria are indicating. To me, the biggest piece of a just transition is really listening. And we've been part of the HIV/AIDS movement, the breast cancer movement, Alzheimer's movement. We really, I believe, in the climate movement, need to think through what is a 360-degree approach to listening. And for us, we focus on the communities where we live, work, and source. And retail, as you know, is a profoundly democratic field. And so we have many, many leaders within our company who come from a vast array of communities. And then lastly, change starts at home. We have very strong racial equity and gender equity commitments across the company, and really want to encourage other companies to do the same. And we have room to grow there too, but we're here and we're listening.
How are other companies listening, Dickon? How are they harnessing the viewpoints of their stakeholders in all their ways and means? Is it quite often, is it different from one company to the next? One, it might be a founder who's got, or CEO who's got very much a focus and a viewpoint, or how much are they looking to within their base and within their stakeholders?
I think companies are in the US, for example, I think that way beyond any kind of ideological discussion that may have been around 3-5 years ago or around the science. I think there is now clear conviction, actually, that, and a lot of this was driven out of the financial sector. I mean, the capital markets have led the way a little bit here. The financial regulator has started to put things like climate stress testing on banks, et cetera, and that is beginning to ripple through the system. So I think companies are beginning that team sport of engaging with different players. Do
you think they led the way? I mean, many people sort of criticize that the Federal Reserve was perhaps a little slow in terms of climate focus. Or do you think that really you could argue that companies led the way?
Well, I think that in a way, as the financial regulator, and initially coming out of the Bank of England, and I think Mark is talking a little bit later, that made the case that climate risk represented an existential threat to financial stability. Mm-hmm. And that has begun to ripple through, and actually has come from Europe to the SEC maybe faster than we thought. But that is. It is a journey. I think what it takes from a company is, I think you need to have a view of the direction of travel here. Mm. You have to have conviction because everything is changing. So as a fiduciary, it's hard to make capital commitments on the basis of things that will happen but that have not yet happened. And I think you've got to have a point of view of where the future is going. I think you've also got to understand that this is going to be a complete rewriting of the basis of competition of companies. You've got to look at what the dislocation is going to be in communities. I think you've got to look at your license to operate. You know, and companies have a societal license, and I think they're beginning to realize that, and that taps back into community. So ultimately, on this agenda, you know, you are your brother's keeper. And I think that is driving more collaboration, but clearly it needs to go at a significantly faster scale, as Gloria was saying.
Gloria, what's so fascinating is you've got these sort of, they need to be always together, whether it's be, you know, looking for sustainability, but doing it in a just fashion. And I think, interestingly, here in the United States, for example, it has become the focus of the Federal Reserve. In large part, the Biden administration sort of looked towards it during the election period, that they wanted them to look at the lower income, those that had been left behind. This wasn't just a central bank that was about, you know, ensuring that we didn't have strong inflation. It was more about, actually, we'll let inflation run a little bit hot because we want the most inclusive labor force we possibly can. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's being looked at the same level of urgency as climate when you're looking at these two things always side by side?
Ooh, the same level of urgency. What I do believe is that communities will require it. And so one of the first lessons, some grounding foundational lessons that I learned, I did 16 years of community organizing in South Central LA, and those grassroots leaders taught me, one, that relationships are the cornerstone of just about everything, and two, that a lot of the conditions that our communities are living with every single day, your community, my community, aren't happenstance or circumstantial, right? Like, it really is about decisions being made every single day by our decision makers. And the most important lesson that they taught me is that I actually had the power and agency to stand up and help to change that, and to shape this type of society that I want to live in. And that's the work that I've been committed to. That's the work that I'm here representing as a philanthropic leader now. But a philanthropic leader that's really committed to the movements that are happening on the ground, because again, these are the infrastructure that's there whether we are or not. And so I really want to join forces with a powerhouse that really is, you know, immovable, right? And no one can shake them out of the way. So I do believe that it's communities who are going to make sure that there is some parity there, and that we move in a more equitable fashion.
To that end, Nancy, do you feel that this 18 months that we've all lived and breathed and lost in, and the fact that we had a health crisis that became such an economic and social crisis, did we in any way lose momentum when it came to climate, or did that automatically go hand in hand?
Well, at least at our company, we felt like we accelerated. I think the knowledge, and to Mr. Khan's remarks earlier, I think the stakes became very clear, and this overlap of poverty and climate injustice and gender injustice has become so stark. I think we also really proved that we can be much more agile and move much more quickly when so much is at stake. And we certainly in our company created a small working group, and we were able to, both fund Médecins Sans Frontières, $30 million across the year, but we also were able to hit our climate goals. And so I think it's actually helped it's a tragic scenario that we've all lived through, and certain communities have absolutely been hit so much harder. But at the same time, I believe it has created this very stark call to action of the stakes, and that we all have one standard of healthcare across the world in many, many ways, and we have one climate. There's that axiom that we're all in the same storm, but we have different boats. And I'd say, particularly as a luxury company, we are really doubling down and engaging our employees and our consumers in creating a global solution.
Well said. I just want to bring our attention back to your own optimism in the audience, as well as those of our panelists. How optimistic are you that we see a just transition to a net zero world? The answers were A, very optimistic, B, mostly optimistic, C, mostly pessimistic, D, very pessimistic. I'm wondering if we can bring up some of the answers to, I think unfortunately you can see them, but we can't hear, so I'm just going to nip out. Looks as though 57% of you are mostly optimistic and 36% are mostly pessimistic. Very few are very optimistic and but it's like more are very pessimistic. Oh dear.
There we go.
I'm feeling a bit depressed.
So you have a 60-40 split there, Caroline.
Yeah. I mean, and not talking about your bond equity portfolio. Let's talk about mostly optimistic, therefore. Let's try and convert. How optimistic are you when you're looking globally? When your companies are global, we're very much focused here on what's happening in the US, and I feel real optimism by what Gloria is saying, the people on the ground making real life change. What are you seeing for the practices that, the global companies you're talking to, the impact in Asia, in Europe, and where's working best?
Well, I'd say, reflecting on this, the 60-40 split that Nancy was saying, I'd say we're on balance optimistic. I think you got to hold both optimism and pessimism. I think if you're too pessimistic, you get paralyzed. If you're too optimistic, you forget about just the massive magnitude. Again, largest reallocation of capital in human history. Changes the basis of competition everywhere. Trade will change. It's a complete restructuring of the economy. It's a massive, massive deal. The thing that gives me optimism, actually, Nancy alluded to it earlier, is the money has to flow into the regions that are most affected, into the communities that are most affected. If you look at the physical risk and transition risk, it is actually highly regressive. So the most vulnerable are most impacted. But therefore, the money needs to flow in, and the jobs that will be created into those same communities, and I think that will be very stimulative. I think that the challenge a bit right now is, if you look particularly in the developing world, just the magnitude of capital that needs to flow into those regions. And we're not seeing money flow into adaptation at the scale it needs. We're not seeing it move into the installed base, which is carbon intensive, to decarbonize it. And we're not seeing it move quite at the scale it needs into developing markets. But
from private or from public sources, or both? Or?
Well, from both. I mean, ultimately, look, 80-90% of this will be done by the private sector. But you'll need the public sector to provide things like loan guarantees to take first loss. You'll need the public sector to stimulate some R&D into new technologies. So it needs to be catalytic and stimulative. But ultimately, the heavy lifting will be done by the private sector. But, we see, it's beginning to move, but the speed and scale going into the current economy and the installed base is not what it needs to be. I think the investment into the sort of net new green things is at a level we've never seen before. Venture capital, growth equity, all those things stimulating technology and innovations happening. But again, I liked the point that a bunch of this money and investment needs to flow back into the very communities that are most affected, and that should hopefully help drive a more just transition.
Are you seeing that money flow into the communities you speak to at the moment, Gloria? Let's be glass half full here, 60% mostly optimistic. Like, do you feel that, what are the sort of jobs that are coming into the communities already? You talk about solar, for example. What else are we seeing in terms of trade?
Just to answer that first question, the reality is that these communities, as I mentioned earlier, have been and are historically underinvested and disinvested, and that has been happening for decades, and it's still happening today. And so part of what I've been calling on and what we're doing at the Solutions Project is making sure that we center our investments into those communities so that at least $10 million annually that we're able to invest. We're here to ask our industry leaders to also see the social infrastructure and grassroots organizations as resources and partners to invest in.
What sort of projects do you invest in, for example? Can you give us one?
Yeah, so some of the ones that I talked about with like the job creation programs, solar grids, people are trying to create resilience hubs so that we're actually responsive when disasters happen. Justice 40 initiative, so we have organizations that have come together to really maximize the 40% commitment from the Biden-Harris administration, although we recognize that that is not justice, right? We put Justice 40, but justice would be doing more, right? Because equity requires us to level the playing field, and 40% ain't it. But, you know, people are saying, hey, you know, government dollars are actually dollars that tend to miss our communities, so what can we do to make sure that we're prepared and that we can create that pipeline? When I think about net zero, I'm somewhere between the very optimistic and mostly, because I do think, you know, as you said, as long as we have our industry leaders, government, and community joining forces, we can do our part to achieve a carbon neutral society. But that is not enough. And so that is what I hope we leave here recognizing, that just reducing carbon is central for sure. But for where we're trying to go, it's not enough. And if we're really centering racial justice and all of what we've been talking about, you know, these communities that are on the front lines of degradation, doing carbon neutral may mean that they're still going to be disproportionately impacted, and some communities will be better off than others. And so let's lean into what this moment is calling us to do and really transform our society and those values and move away from some of those values I mentioned earlier to those of interdependence, community, regeneration, reparations even, which is just saying that we have to repair the harm that we've already caused, because sometimes it's a scary word for people, but that's all that it means, is recognizing that we've done some harm, and so let's do better.
Nancy, let's do better. Talk to us about the optimism you have within Estee Lauder to continue to communicate with your own consumer base to make real effect change. I mean, are you looking at your supply chain? How are you looking at the ways that you said already you've ingrained it within the business itself to ensure that you're looking at a more equitable workforce, employee base? But what about when you're looking at supply chains as well, of being equitable but also environmentally friendly?
Yeah, 90% of our footprint, just to give you a sense, is in our scope 3, which is all of our suppliers. And so just to underscore Gloria and Dixon's point, that's really where we need to make the difference. And absolutely, with our new science-based target, in every business will be mobilizing to solve with their suppliers. And CDP supply chain is a big help there. As we move forward, I would say what we really need are, I would say, to kind of bridge Dickon's and Gloria's worlds, essentially. We need local innovation in green solutions that benefit communities. And candidly, currently, we don't have enough of them. So I would say, as a call to action, we all need to invest in just local green energy solutions that are viable for companies like ours to adopt. Also, just on another front, we've invested recently in a group called Co-Impact, which just created a gender fund around the Global South. And as we know, women in the Global South have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. They will be funding local programs and supporting locally successful women-led programs. And I think we need to marry those two. And in the climate community, take a look at other civil rights movements and really bring in, through consumers, through employees, and through all of us as citizens, this democratic element and this democratic conversation. So I'm very optimistic about that and look forward to being part of it.
And Caroline, one thing that I'm, listening to you, it makes me think that the reality is that it's so easy to have a clean energy economy that still has the same structural inequities and income inequality and racism and sexism that exists today. And so that's why carbon neutral is not enough, because we actually want a society where everyone has access to clean water, healthy food, good jobs, affordable transit and energy systems, heating and cooling systems. And so that's the society that we're trying to build. And that's what I'm hoping will lean into that opportunity and not just stop when, we think we've reduced carbon.
Hear, hear. Gloria, Walton, thank you so much for bringing that perspective, of course, the CEO of the Solutions Project. It's been wonderful to have you here in person as well. Dickon Pinner, of course, the McKinsey San Francisco office. And a joy to have you virtually, but it felt like you were in the room with us. Nancy and Mahon, thank you so much over at the Estee Lauder companies. Just please give it up to what a wonderful conversation that was.